Hey there. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a story. I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now, take a deep breath, relax, and let your mind drift. These horror stories will crawl under your skin and linger in the dark. Let's begin. The first time I saw it, I thought it was a trick of the dark, the kind of thing teenagers tell each other to get a laugh. But the way my friend slammed the car door and swore made me shut up. We were driving home late, the kind of road that pinches between trees and drops into blackness. And out of nowhere, there was a shape in the road, or above the road. I still don't know which. It was big. Bigger than a man, with a silhouette that didn't make sense in the moonlight, to red glows where eyes should be. I remember my throat tightening and my friend saying, "Drive," almost without thinking, like the word itself could move us faster. We didn't stop. We didn't slow down until we hit the lights of town and realized our hands were shaking. After that, there were stories everywhere. People who'd been cutting wood said something watched them from the ridge. A couple who'd been walking the hiking path swore something flew at them and beat the leaves with air that smelled like wet feathers. The sheriff took reports, not like a game, but like paperwork that should make sense and didn't. I remember the newspaper headline the next day. I remember older folks who scoffed, and older folks who fell silent when the kids shared their stories. I was not a believer in legends. I ran a small auto repair with my brother, and our time was measured in bolts and tire irons, not omens. But late one November night, after a long day, I went out to check on a truck we'd left by the tree line because the owner had already left a key. I shouldn't have been alone. The woods were quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your eardrums. Then something moved in the treetops, like a shadow that didn't belong. It was low, closer than I expected, and I heard a sound that was neither a bird nor a man's cry. It was a flapping, heavy and slow. I froze, and the hairs on my neck prickled. There was a feeling of being looked at, the way you feel when you walk into a room and someone's watching you play with the idea for a second before you notice. I backed up, not taking my eyes off that shape. It didn't come closer, not at first. It hovered, and then, just like that, it turned and flew along the tree line, disappearing into the deeper dark. I hadn't slept well in days after that. I told myself later that I'd seen a large owl or a hawk with a bad angle in the headlights. I told myself there was always an explanation, but there were too many sightings for that to be comforting. People reported the same red eyes, the same overwhelming size, the same feeling afterward, like a warning had been given, and nobody knew what it meant. The real panic that lasted shifted from stories to something far more real one cold December day. A bridge that linked our little stretch of highway folded like a deck of cards under the weight of evening traffic. Cars went down into the dark water. The next weeks were filled with body bags and names we all knew. There were funerals, and at one of them, I stood next to a woman who used to bring her kids to the diner. She didn't talk about what we had seen in the woods. She only asked me, quietly, "Did you ever see anything strange before?" Her hands trembled when she held the program. I wanted to tell her about the red eyes, but the words felt like they would make the world more real in a way no one needed. After the collapse, people tried to make sense of the timing. Some said the sightings stopped because whatever it was had been heard or had warned us. Others said the sightings were a coincidence, a freak of rural life and rumor. Investigators came, engineers wrote reports, and the world outside filed the town away as a tragedy in a national news cycle. Years later, someone wrote a book about the months before the collapse. People read it like it was confirmation or like it was entertainment, depending on what they wanted. We still went to work, fixed engines, bought groceries, but some evenings, when the wind came down off the ridges and the trees whispered, you could feel the old fear in the hollows. Once, an old man came into the shop and sat on a stool like he'd been delivered there by force of habit. He was quiet until the coffee started cooling. Then he said, without looking up, "You know what I saw, boy?" I said no, because I didn't want to lie. He told me about a night when he was a kid, working graves with the others, and they all saw something weird fly over the cemetery. He used words like monstrous and unnatural, but his voice was steady, like someone telling a story he'd told 20 times. After he left, my brother and I looked at one another, like we both understood that the town had always held things you didn't speak of much. I don't claim to know what we were seeing. I am not a man who believes in signs, but I am a man who remembers cold nights, glowing red lights, and a town that once felt safe being split by an event that left real, physical wreckage. The way I tell it now, sitting at my counter while customers drift in and out. Some people nod like they remember. Some look nervous and ask questions, as if I'm a source of gossip. Once, a kid came in and asked if the creature was still around. I told him, truthfully, that I hadn't seen it in years. He wanted to press, but his father called him away. Maybe it was a mass of misidentified birds and a coincidence of tragedy. Maybe it was something else, and the collapse was unrelated. Both possibilities are hard to live with. The last thing I'll say is this. Years later, when they rebuilt the road and traffic moved again as if nothing had happened, my brother and I took a drive out past the old industrial site where people said the sightings started. There was a stillness we hadn't noticed before, an emptiness where attention used to live. We drove slow, windows down, listening for anything that would remind us. The only sound was the creek running and the hollow sigh of wind through bare limbs. I told my brother, maybe some things are better left without names. He grunted and changed the station. I've kept my eyes open over the years. I've learned that memory and rumor not together until you can't separate the truth. I don't know what that red glare was, and I don't know if it will come back. All I know is what I felt that night, the way fear settles into your chest and makes the rest of the world feel sharp and small. That and the sound of an engine stalling, like something calling your attention to the fact that things can change in a single awful breath. Story 2. I was staying at my uncle's place that fall, helping him patch up the roof before the cold set in. He lived halfway up an old ridge road where the gravel was more pothole than surface, and the nearest neighbor was a mile off. The nights there felt different, like the dark had weight. No streetlights, no passing cars, just the black tree line pressing in on all sides. When the sun went down, you couldn't see the ridgeline anymore, just shapes on shapes, folding into a darkness so thick it almost hummed in your ears. That week had been quiet. My uncle was one of those men who didn't talk unless he had something worth saying. And I've never been good at filling silences, so the house had a stillness to it. Most nights I'd read by the wood stove until I got tired, but one evening I stepped out to get firewood from the shed. The shed sat maybe 20 yards from the house, just beyond the edge of the yard light. I could see it clearly enough, but the woods behind it were a different story. They started sharp, no gradual thinning, just grass, one step, trees the next. I was halfway to the shed when I heard something in those trees. It wasn't loud at first, just a few slow crunches, like someone shifting their weight on dry leaves. My first thought was deer. They wandered down here often enough, and I'd seen to crossing the road that morning. But when I stopped to listen, so did the steps. The air felt heavier then, like I was suddenly aware of how far I was from anyone else. I called out without really thinking, "Hey, who's there?" My voice didn't echo the way I expected. Instead, it seemed to fall flat, like the woods absorbed it. Nothing moved. I stood there longer than I should have, listening, but the sound didn't come back. I grabbed the firewood and went in, trying to brush it off. My uncle was in his chair, sipping coffee even though it was nearly 9 p.m. I told him what I'd heard, but he just said, "Could be anything." He didn't even look up from his cup, but when I glanced over later, I caught him staring out the window toward the shed. The next morning, over breakfast, my uncle mentioned a man from farther up the ridge who hadn't been seen in almost a week. He was a quiet sort, apparently, kept to himself, so folks didn't notice right away. The sheriff had already been up and down the road a few times, asking questions, but nobody had anything useful. When I brought up the noise in the woods again, my uncle only said, "You hear a lot out here at night. Doesn't mean it's worth chasing after." Still, he seemed distracted, his gaze flicking toward the tree line every so often, like he was keeping count of something. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were watching. The wind barely moved, but I kept hearing faint rustles, as if something was working its way around the property. Around midnight, I heard a single knock on the side of the house. Not a branch scraping or something falling. A knock, solid, intentional. The dog didn't bark. In fact, he stayed under my uncle's bed all night, shivering. The next day, the sheriff's cruiser pulled into the driveway. I stayed on the porch while the deputy and sheriff talked to my uncle. Their voices were low, but I caught enough to hear that they'd found the missing man's truck halfway down an old logging road a couple miles up, driver's side door wide open, keys still in the ignition. No sign of him anywhere. I wanted to ask questions, but when the sheriff glanced at me, there was something in his eyes that made me shut my mouth. After they left, my uncle didn't say much, just muttered something about keeping the shed locked and making sure the dog stayed inside. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat in the living room with the wood stove going, staring at the window. Around 2 a.m., I stepped outside, more to shake off the restlessness than anything. The air was cold enough to make my breath hang in the yard light. The woods were silent at first. Then I heard them, soft footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from behind the shed. I froze right there on the porch, trying to figure out if I was imagining it. The footsteps stopped the moment I turned my head toward the shed. My eyes kept searching the edge of the yard light, where the grass met the trees, but there was nothing, just blackness between the trunks. I thought about calling out again, but the idea of hearing nothing back was worse than whatever I might see. So I stepped off the porch, quiet as I could, keeping my eyes on that dark spot behind the shed. My boots crunched a little in the gravel, and for a few seconds, the only sound was my own breathing. Then, another step, not mine. I stopped. Whoever it was stopped too. The space between us felt thin, like we were both waiting for the other to make a move. I walked slowly to the shed door, my hand shaking a little as I reached for the padlock. My uncle had locked it earlier, but when I touched it, it wasn't latched. It swung open with the faintest creak. Inside, everything was as it should be. Stacks of firewood, some tools hanging on the wall, the smell of old cedar. I backed out, slowly, keeping my eyes on the tree line. That's when I saw it. Not a person exactly, but a shape, low to the ground, maybe crouched, right at the edge of the woods. I blinked, and it was gone, like it melted backward into the dark. My stomach turned cold. I went back inside and locked the door, every lock we had. My uncle was still awake in his chair. I told him what I saw. He didn't ask for details, just got up, pulled the curtain shut, and said, "Stay inside tomorrow. Don't go out there." The next day, I barely stepped out at all. Around mid-afternoon, a neighbor stopped by, one of the only ones within walking distance. He'd heard about the missing man too, and mentioned how search parties were combing the ridge. Then he said something that made my skin crawl. They found prints in the mud near that old truck, he told us. Not boot prints, bare feet. Looked like whoever it was had been walking that way for miles. That night was worse. The knocking came again, but this time it was on the back wall of the house, closer to my room. 3 knocks, slow and spaced out. I didn't even move from my bed. The dog whimpered and hid under the blankets. Around 3 a.m., I heard the shed door slam. I sat up, heart pounding, listening to the sound of something moving through the yard. The crunch of leaves, a pause, then the faint sound of breathing just outside my window. I lay there in the dark, every muscle locked until the breathing stopped. By morning, the only sign anything had happened was the shed door swinging open again, even though I was sure I'd locked it the night before. My uncle didn't say a word when he saw it. He just closed it, locked it, and told me to start packing. We left before noon. I never found out if they found the missing man. Story 3. Kenny Miller was 15 when he vanished on that October afternoon. He'd been at a church picnic with his parents, up in a clearing tucked between 2 ridges. It wasn't far from their home, maybe a 20-minute drive, but the spot felt cut off from everything. No cell service back then, just the sound of the wind sliding through the trees. People remembered the day as bright and cold. The sun was sharp, the kind of light that made the fallen leaves look almost on fire. Kenny had wandered off from the group sometime after lunch. A few folks saw him walking toward the tree line, head down, hands in his pockets. At first, nobody thought much of it. He'd always been quiet, more comfortable on his own. An hour later, his mother started asking if anyone had seen him. Then his father joined in, calling his name, walking up and down the dirt road that curved out of the clearing. By mid-afternoon, the search was on in earnest. People fanned out through the woods, shouting, clapping, hoping he'd hear. The cold came on quick when the sun dipped behind the ridge. By nightfall, law enforcement had been called. Flashlights swept the trails, the beam catching in the fog that had begun to creep up from the hollow. Deputies asked questions, but the answers were all the same. Kenny had walked into the woods and hadn't come back. No one had seen him after that. The next morning, searchers found his jacket draped neatly over a fallen log less than a mile from the picnic area. It wasn't torn, and there was nothing in the pockets. A few yards away, there were small scuff marks in the dirt, as if someone had been standing still for a long time, shifting their weight. The search went on for days. Helicopters circled. Volunteers combed every hollow, every ridge. But there was no trace beyond the jacket. No tracks, no dropped belongings, nothing. What unsettled the searchers most wasn't what they found, it was what they didn't hear. Normally, in those woods, there's always something: the chatter of squirrels, birds calling, the occasional rustle of a deer. But that week, in the area where Kenny disappeared, it was quiet, almost completely still. On the third night, one of the search teams reported hearing faint footsteps paralleling theirs in the dark. Every time they stopped, the sound stopped too. They shone their lights into the trees, but the beams caught nothing. The searchers kept moving, trying to shake off the feeling of being shadowed. One of them called out Kenny's name, his voice breaking the silence. No answer came back, only the sound of their own boots in the leaves. By the fifth day, most of the volunteers had gone home. The official search was scaled back, though deputies still walked the logging roads and drainages during daylight. Kenny's parents stayed at the site, sleeping in their car at night, hoping that maybe he'd wander back. On the sixth day, a team working farther up the ridge found something. A single shoe, Kenny's, confirmed by his parents, resting upright in the middle of a narrow deer path. It wasn't muddy, and the laces were still tied. The ground around it was undisturbed, as if it had been set there. That discovery brought more searchers back out, but it also shifted the mood. Now there were quiet arguments between deputies, speculation about whether Kenny had wandered farther than anyone guessed, or if someone had helped him disappear. No one could explain how the shoe got there. Weeks passed without answers. Winter moved in, laying frost over the hollow where his jacket was found. The official investigation wound down, leaving only his parents to keep looking. They'd walk the trails in the mornings, leaving food and water in old coffee cans near the places searchers had last been. Years later, one of the original searchers admitted something he'd never told the sheriff. On the third night of the search, the night they heard footsteps, he'd thought he saw a figure in the trees. Not close enough to make out a face, just the outline of someone standing between two oaks. He'd blinked, and it was gone. He never mentioned it at the time because he couldn't be sure, and he didn't want to cause more pain to Kenny's family. Kenny was never found. The case remains open, with no suspects and no confirmed sightings. People in that part of the mountains still talk about it sometimes, usually in the fall when the leaves turn. They'll mention how the air goes still in that hollow, and how you can stand there and feel, just for a moment, like you're not alone. I don't usually mess with abandoned places, but that day I went along anyway. My friend Ben had been talking about this old house for weeks, a place he said had been left untouched since the late 80s. Halfway up a switchback road that nobody used anymore. He'd found it while hiking, said there were still dishes in the sink and clothes in the closets. We drove up in his beat-up Chevy, the kind of truck where the floor rattled every time you hit a pothole. The road was narrow and overgrown, with tree branches leaning in so close they scraped the sides. By the time we reached the driveway, you could barely see the roof of the house through the brush. The place looked tired, but not falling apart. 2 stories, pale paint flaking off the siding, porch half sagging under its own weight. The front door was shut, but not locked. We stepped inside, and the air felt stale, like no one had moved it in decades. Dust floated in the light from the front window. Ben went straight upstairs, while I stayed in the living room, looking at the furniture. It was all still there: sofa, coffee table, even a pair of reading glasses resting on an armrest. On the wall was a calendar frozen on August 1989. The dates were filled in with tiny handwriting, mostly grocery lists and initials. I started toward the kitchen, and that's when I noticed something strange. The carpet had these dark oval patches every few feet, like places where someone had stood for a long time. They formed a faint trail, leading from the front door into the kitchen, then turning toward the hallway. Ben called from upstairs, asking if I'd seen the photos in the hallway. I hadn't, so I started down the hall. The pictures were of the same couple over and over again, different years, same two faces. What stopped me was the last frame at the very end. It had no glass, and the photo inside was faded, but I could still make out the woman's face. She looked terrified, not posed, not smiling, just caught mid-turn, eyes wide at something behind the camera. I was still staring at it when Ben came down, holding something in his hand. "Found this in the bedroom closet," he said, showing me an old Polaroid. It was of the same living room we'd just walked through, only in the picture there was someone standing in the corner. The face was blurred, but the outline was wrong. Too tall, too narrow. We both laughed it off, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that feels right. Then I noticed something else in the photo. Those same dark oval patches in the carpet. Only in the picture, there were more of them. We decided to head out, but when we stepped into the hallway, something about the air had changed. It wasn't just still anymore. It felt charged, like the pressure before a storm. I heard a faint creak upstairs. Ben swore under his breath. We'd both heard it. We stood in the hallway for what felt like a full minute, just listening. The creak had come from upstairs, slow, deliberate, like someone shifting their weight on old floorboards. Ben tried to shrug it off, but I could see his eyes darting toward the staircase. "How settling," he muttered, though his voice didn't sound convinced. I nodded, mostly to keep the moment moving, but we both knew the boards upstairs had already had 3 decades to settle. We stepped toward the front door, moving a little faster now. Halfway there, the sound came again. Only this time, it was closer, like whatever it was had moved from one end of the upstairs hall to the other. We stopped, frozen in place, eyes locked on the top of the stairs. Nothing moved. Ben was gripping that Polaroid so tight the edges were bending. "Let's just go," I said, low, not wanting to raise my voice in that heavy air. He nodded, but then we both flinched at another sound, 2 short taps from directly above us. We didn't even look at each other after that. We just left. The outside air felt thinner, easier to breathe. I was halfway to the truck when Ben stopped. "Hold on," he said, glancing back at the house. His face had gone pale. I turned to see what he was looking at. The upstairs curtain, the one in the front bedroom, had shifted. Not fast, just a slow sway, like someone had brushed past it. We didn't stay to watch. By the time we were on the main road, we'd convinced ourselves it was a draft, maybe from an open window. Still, neither of us said much the rest of the ride. That night, Ben called me. His voice was shaky in a way I'd never heard from him. He said when he got home, he'd taken the Polaroid out of his pocket to look at it again. Only now, there was something in it he swore hadn't been there before. In the corner of the photo, just behind the figure, was a blurry shape in the doorway. Its outline was faint, but it looked like someone standing there with their head tilted as if they were watching. I didn't know what to say, so I just listened while he kept describing it, his words speeding up like he wanted to get them out before he lost the nerve. Then, right in the middle of talking, he stopped. "Hold on," he whispered. "I think I just heard." And the line went dead. Story 5. His mother had parked their truck nearby, keeping Paul inside, where she could glance over at him between loads. He liked the smell of the diesel engines and the crunch of gravel under the big trucks. And he was used to waiting while his parents worked. That morning he'd been quiet, staring out the windshield toward the slope that rose behind the dump. She thought he might have stepped out to stretch his legs, but when she called his name, there was no answer. She walked the perimeter first, checking the small shed where they kept tools, the path down toward the stream. Nothing. But as the minutes stretched, they began calling more urgently, their voices carrying into the quiet woods. By the time the police were notified, an hour had passed. Officers and volunteers spread out in lines, combing the slope above the dump. The bright jacket should have made him easy to spot. It didn't. Dogs were brought in that afternoon. They caught a scent near the truck, followed it a short way up the hill, then stopped dead on a stretch of open ground. The handlers couldn't explain it. There was no scent trail beyond that point, as if Paul had simply vanished in the middle of the clearing. That night, the search area was lit with spotlights. Men called his name until their voices grew hoarse. Some swore they heard movement just beyond the light's edge, but when they went toward it, there was nothing. They led a short distance before veering into thick brush and disappearing entirely. Paul's mother told reporters later that he'd been talking for days about wanting to go up into the mountains. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now it weighed on her. She couldn't understand how he could have gotten so far so quickly, or why there was no sign of him anywhere. The temperatures were dropping, and the hope of finding Paul alive was fading. Still, the volunteers kept walking the ridges, listening for any sound in the darkness. The steps matched their pace, stopping when they stopped, starting when they moved again. When they turned with their lights, there was no one there, only the mist curling low along the ground. No answer. They swept their flashlights back over the road, but the mist seemed to swallow the light, making the trees look closer than they really were. This time, one man turned quickly, shining his beam low to catch movement near the ground. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure between two trees, but the mist shifted and the shape was gone. That was the last time anyone reported hearing the footsteps during the official search. By the 5th day, the search was scaled down. State police had joined in, helicopters had flown over the ridgelines, and every drainage, hollow, and game trail for miles had been checked. There was still no trace of Paul, no clothing, no prints, nothing left behind. Paul's father stayed out longer than the rest most nights. He'd walk up the slope with a flashlight, stopping to listen every few minutes. One night, near the end of the 2nd week, he told another volunteer that he'd heard what sounded like a child humming somewhere above the road. He'd climbed toward the sound, but it had faded before he could reach the tree line. He didn't bring it up to the police, worried they'd think he was imagining it from exhaustion. As winter approached, the searches became sporadic. Local hunters were told to keep an eye out for any sign, but months passed without a single lead. The dump stayed open, though fewer people lingered after dark. Even years later, people still talked about how strange that part of the mountain felt, how easy it was to get turned around, how the air seemed heavier there, especially near the clearing where the dogs had lost Paul's scent. In later interviews, Paul's mother mentioned something she'd kept to herself at the time. 2 days before he went missing, Paul had told her, "I want to go where the lines meet." She thought it was a child's nonsense phrase, maybe something from a radio program or story he'd heard. She didn't think of it again until after he vanished. The case never closed. Officially, the theory was that Paul had wandered into the mountains and been lost to the elements. Unofficially, the locals had their own thoughts. Some believed he'd been taken. Others said the land up there could play tricks on a person, leading them in circles until they gave up. Even now, on quiet evenings, people say you can hear small, deliberate footsteps on the old logging road above the dump. They stop when you stop, and no matter how fast you turn, there's never anyone there. Story 6. I'd been camping alone in the mountains before, but this time felt different from the start. I can't say why exactly. Maybe it was the late season. The leaves had already turned and fallen, leaving the trees bare and the wind sharper. Or maybe it was how quiet the place seemed when I pulled off the dirt road and into the clearing I'd chosen. The site wasn't marked, just a flat patch of ground near a creek bend, far enough from the road that you couldn't hear a single car. I'd hiked into this spot with friends years earlier, but this time I'd brought my gear in the truck and planned to park just far enough into the woods to be out of sight. By the time I pitched my tent, the sun was already dropping behind the ridge. The light filtered through the branches in thin orange slats, and the air had that damp smell of cold earth. I built a small fire, cooked a bit of stew in my old camping pot, and listened to the creek. The first odd thing happened just after dark. I was tossing another log on the fire when I heard a splash from downstream, louder than the usual ripple of water over rocks. I leaned forward to look, thinking maybe a deer had come down to drink, but the water was still. The sound didn't repeat. I went back to eating, but the hairs on my arms stayed up. Later, while getting ready to turn in, I walked to the edge of the clearing to hang my food bag from a branch. The moonlight was strong enough to outline the treetops, but the spaces between the trunks were solid black. Just as I was tying the rope, I heard footsteps in the leaves, slow, careful steps, maybe 30 yards away. I froze, waiting for the sound to stop, and it did. I told myself it was an animal, probably a raccoon nosing around. But raccoons don't usually keep such a steady pace. Back at the fire, I sat and listened for a long while. Every so often, I thought I heard faint movement, something circling the clearing at a distance. The fabric rattled lightly, and every creak or snap from the woods felt closer than it probably was. Around midnight, I woke to a sound I couldn't place. It was faint, but distinct, 2 short taps on metal, like someone knocking gently on the side of my truck. I sat up, listening hard. The tapping didn't come again. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it had been a branch falling, maybe hitting the hood before rolling off. Still, I stayed awake for over an hour, just listening to the fire die down outside. When I finally drifted back to sleep, it didn't last long. At some point deep in the night, I woke again, this time to a different sound. Breathing. Slow, steady breathing, just outside the tent wall, near my head. I lay frozen, heart hammering, staring at the thin nylon wall of the tent. The breathing was unmistakable now, slow, rhythmic, and close enough that I could almost count the seconds between each inhale and exhale. I told myself it might be an animal, maybe a bear, or a big bobcat, but the sound didn't match anything I'd ever heard before. It was too deliberate. My eyes scanned the faint moonlight leaking through the fabric, searching for any shape or shadow. The fire had gone out hours ago, and the clearing was swallowed in darkness. Then the breathing stopped. Silence fell so thick I could hear my own blood pounding in my ears. I tried to calm myself, to remind myself that the woods were full of animals and strange sounds, especially at night. Maybe it had been a coyote breathing just outside, or a raccoon curious about the tent. Deliberate knock tapped on the side of the tent, not once, but 3 times, slow and measured. I swallowed hard and whispered, "Who's there?" No answer. The kind of silence that followed felt heavier than anything I'd ever felt in the woods, like the darkness itself was holding its breath. Instead, I reached slowly for my flashlight, trying to keep my movements quiet. When I clicked it on, the beam sliced through the thin tent wall and into the trees beyond. Nothing, no movement, no glowing eyes, just empty branches swaying gently in the night breeze. No footprints, no eyes reflecting back, no signs that anyone or anything had been near. I sat back down, but the feeling didn't leave me. I felt watched, the kind of watching that doesn't come from curiosity, but from something else, something patient and waiting. Time passed in slow, heavy stretches. I tried to focus on my breathing, on the rhythm of the forest, but every tiny sound made me jump. The occasional rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, the hoot of an owl, each one sharpened my nerves instead of soothing them. At some point, I must have dozed off. I don't know how long I slept before I woke again, this time to a different sound. Soft footsteps, barely louder than the rustling leaves, moving slowly around the edge of the clearing. I held my breath, straining to listen. The steps paused just beyond the trees, then moved on, circling around the tent. I could feel the weight of eyes on me. I wanted to call out, to shout, but my voice caught in my throat. I didn't know what I'd say. The footsteps stopped directly outside the tent wall near my head. My flashlight was still on the ground beside me, but I couldn't reach it without making noise. Then, a whisper. It was so faint, I almost thought I'd imagined it. Just one word, "Go," and then nothing. When I finally zipped open the door, the clearing looked normal. No footprints, no broken branches. No sign that anyone had been there except me. I packed up quickly and didn't stop to look back until I was halfway down the dirt road. Even then, I kept my eyes on the trees. I never went back. Story 7. I had been planning this solo hike for months. Study the maps until the trails are as familiar as your own street, and set out early enough to give yourself plenty of daylight. The Appalachians offer some of the best backcountry, and I wanted to test myself on a ridge trail that cut through dense forest with hardly any traffic. That perfect mix of fall warmth, holding on to the edges of the early sun. I slipped my pack on and took a deep breath of pine and damp earth, the kind of smell that sticks to your clothes long after you leave. The first few miles were easy. The trail climbed steadily but gently, weaving through groves of hardwoods with leaves in the last stages of fiery red and gold. The sound of a creek running close by accompanied me, steady and comforting. Birds flitted overhead, and every so often I'd catch the flash of a squirrel disappearing into the brush. The trail narrowed, and the light filtering through the canopy grew patchier, shadows lengthening even though it was still mid-morning. I stopped for a snack on a mossy rock, feeling the cool dampness seep through my jeans. Something about the quiet felt different, like the forest had shifted from being a place alive with creatures to something else, something watching. I chalked it up to being alone. The kind of trail where cell service disappears and you have to trust your instincts as much as your map. The trail soon began to skirt a steep drop-off on my right. I could see the valley below, a patchwork of fields and forest edges fading into a blue haze. The wind was stronger here, rustling through the pines and sending loose needles drifting down. I paused to take it all in, heart pounding a little from the climb and the view. No broken branches, nothing that explained the sound. I kept moving, but slower now, senses stretched tight. Every so often, I thought I caught glimpses of something just out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that didn't quite line up with a tree or rock. I told myself it was the light playing tricks, but the feeling of being watched grew heavier. The walls were gone, but the stone chimney still stood, blackened with soot and moss-covered. I sat on one of the fallen beams to rest, pulling out my water bottle. The silence here was absolute. No birds, no breeze, just the distant rush of the creek. I checked my phone. No signal, of course. I texted my partner a quick, "All good, hiking the ridge." No reply, but that was normal. I always told her to expect silence when I was out here. This time, unmistakable and close. There was no one there. I called out, "Hello." My voice sounded small in the stillness. No answer. I stood up quickly, slinging my pack on. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I wanted to get off that ridge fast, but the trail looped back around, and I knew it would take at least another hour to get back to the road. I glanced back, but again, no one. The sound kept pace, then stopped when I stopped, like some unseen shadow was mirroring me. Panic started to creep in, but I told myself to stay focused. I took out my pocket knife, gripping it loosely, and picked up my pace. The trail was muddy, and I slid once, catching myself on a low branch. The footsteps faded with the thicker trees, but I kept looking back, expecting to see someone or something every time. I finally reached the road as the sun started to dip. Relief washed over me when I saw a couple of cars parked near the trailhead. I jogged the last 100 yards and nearly collapsed into the cab of my truck. The footsteps, the silence, the feeling of being followed. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was probably hunters or other hikers, but no one had passed me on the trail. And there was one thing I couldn't shake, the sound of a voice, faint and almost swallowed by the wind, calling my name from somewhere deep in the forest. I first heard it just as I crossed the small stream where the trail dipped and curved. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart hammering so loud I was sure it echoed through the trees. "Did you hear that?" I muttered to myself, scanning the woods on either side. The fading light caught the edges of the trunks and dead leaves, but nothing moved. Just the quiet forest, like nothing was out of place. Every few minutes, the whisper came again, sometimes just a syllable of my name. Sometimes a barely audible call that sounded like someone struggling to speak through a thick fog. The footsteps were back, soft and deliberate, just beyond the trees. They moved with me, but I never caught a glimpse of the source. I tried calling out, "Who's there?" My voice cracked and sounded small against the vast silence. No answer. Every sense I had was on high alert. The path twisted ahead, disappearing into thick brush and steep slopes. The forest floor was littered with sticks and rocks, and I was sure I heard snapping twigs from just off the path more than once. I pushed myself faster, my legs burning, but the feeling of being followed intensified. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edge of my vision, and the whispering voice grew more urgent, more desperate. Sometimes it was a soft plea, like someone begging for help. As dusk turned to dark, the forest closed in completely. I switched on my flashlight, but the beam barely pierced the thick canopy and heavy fog rolling in from the valley below. The trail became slippery and uneven. I lost my footing once, nearly falling down a small embankment. Suddenly, I caught movement just ahead, a flash of something pale, maybe fabric or skin, disappearing behind a tree. I froze, heart racing, and called out again. No response. I started to doubt myself. Was I imagining things? Was the exhaustion making me see and hear things that weren't there? But the knife in my hand reminded me this was no dream. I heard the footsteps again, closer now, pacing just behind me. The whisper turned into a soft, broken sobbing. I stopped. "Please," I said, voice shaking. "If you're there, I'm not going to hurt you." The sobbing stopped abruptly. Silence pressed down on me like a weight. Then, without warning, a single twig snapped sharply to my right. I swung my flashlight around. The beam caught the glint of eyes reflecting back at me. Small, dark, unblinking. A fox, maybe, or a raccoon. It vanished instantly into the shadows. I exhaled a shaky breath and kept moving, desperate to get back to the truck, back to safety. The trail finally bent toward the road. I could see the dim glow of headlights in the distance. When I stepped onto the gravel shoulder, I almost collapsed with relief. I pulled out my phone, desperate for signal, and for once the screen lit up with bars. I called my partner, voice trembling. "I'm okay," I said, though it hardly felt true, but something was out there. I don't know what. She told me to come home right away. Driving back down the mountain, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing at the tree line, watching me leave. But when I blinked, it was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the whispering voice calling my name, begging silently from the woods. I never went back to that trail.